My sister pulled a photograph out of her bag at my mother's dinner table. She said it was my secret child, a baby I had hidden and abandoned. My parents didn't ask a single question. My mother pointed at the door. I walked out into the cold and spent 5 years becoming someone they were never prepared for. There are moments in your life that split everything into a before and an after. Not the dramatic ones you expect. Not the car accidents or the diagnoses or the funerals. The ones that split you are the quiet ones. The ones that happen over Sunday dinner while someone is still chewing. I need you to picture a table. It's a round wooden dining table in a house in Decatur, Georgia, the same table we've eaten at for 23 years. The one with the burn ring near the edge from a pot my mother set down too fast in 1999 and never fully forgave herself for. The one where we celebrated my father's promotion, where my grandmother told us she was sick, where every important thing in our family had ever been said out loud. I am sitting at that table on a Sunday in December. It is cold outside, the kind of cold that makes Atlanta feel confused about its own identity. There are jollof rice and fried plantains and the specific smell of pepper soup that I have loved since I was 4 years old. Everything looks completely normal. And then my sister Chisholm reaches into her handbag, pulls out a photograph, and places it face up in the center of the table. It is a picture of a little girl, maybe 2, maybe 3 years old. Curly hair, round cheeks, sitting on what looks like a park bench somewhere I don't recognize. I have never seen this child in my life. Chisholm's voice breaks, and I want you to understand she was good at this. Her voice breaks in that specific way that sounds like someone who has been holding something painful for a very long time and can't hold it anymore. She tells my parents, with tears running down her face, that this is my daughter, that I have been hiding her for 3 years, that the father is a man I refuse to name, that I had abandoned this child, left her with strangers, and sworn Chisholm to secrecy under threat of cutting her off completely. Every single word of it was a lie. I remember opening my mouth. I remember the sound that came out not being a sentence yet just air, just the beginning of what, and my mother raised her hand. Not to hit me, just to stop me. The way you stop a child who is about to say something embarrassing in public. Then she pointed at the door. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. My mother simply looked at me with an expression I had genuinely never seen on her face before, something colder than anger, and she said, "You will not sit at this table until you tell the truth about what you have done." My father said nothing. He looked at his plate. I looked at Chisholm. She was looking at her hands. I picked up my coat from the back of the chair. I walked to the door. I opened it. The cold hit me immediately, that particular Atlanta December cold that goes straight through whatever you're wearing, and I stood on the porch for exactly 3 seconds before I understood that no one was going to come after me. I drove to a parking lot 2 miles away, and I sat there for 2 hours with the engine running. At 11:47 p.m. my mother sent me a single text message. It said, "Confess the truth and come home. We love you, but we cannot protect a daughter who abandons her own blood." I read it 4 times. Then I put my phone face down on the passenger seat, and I drove to the apartment I had signed the lease on 3 days earlier. An empty studio with no furniture, no curtains, a sleeping bag I'd bought for a camping trip 2 summers ago, and a work laptop. That was December 14th. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had spent 9 years in financial compliance, which means I had spent 9 years being the person in the room who notices the detail everyone else walks past. I didn't know yet what I was going to find, but I knew, sitting on that floor in that empty apartment, that a lie that precise has a paper trail somewhere. They always do. That should have been the end of the story. It wasn't even close to the beginning of what I was about to find. My name is Adiz Mills. I was 29 years old the night my mother pointed at that door. I want to tell you who I was before that happened because I think it matters. I think it matters that you understand exactly what kind of person gets chosen for this particular kind of destruction, because it is never random. People like Chisholm don't pick their targets randomly. They pick the one whose fall will be the most useful to them. I grew up in Decatur, Georgia, second daughter of Nigerian immigrants who came to this country in 1987 with 2 suitcases, 1 contact, and the specific brand of ambition that doesn't have a Western word for it. My father, Emmanuel, built a small accounting practice over 20 years, The kind of business that survives on community trust, on church referrals, on the fact that people in the Nigerian American community in Atlanta knew his name and associated it with honesty. My mother, Ngozi, ran the household and for many years ran a small catering operation out of our kitchen. Pepper soup, egusi, jollof for weddings and naming ceremonies and graduations across 3 counties. Reputation was not just important in our house. Reputation was the house. I was the older daughter by 3 years, which meant I was, from a very early age, the one who was supposed to set the example. I did homework at the kitchen table while my mother cooked. I got a full academic scholarship to Georgia State. I graduated with a degree in finance and went directly into a compliance analyst role at a mid-sized logistics firm in Buckhead. By the time I was 27, I was managing audit trails for contracts worth upward of $4 million. By 29, the year of the photograph, I had just been quietly shortlisted for a senior analyst promotion that would have meant a $22,000 salary increase and a move to the firm's regional oversight team. I was the daughter who sent $400 home every month without being asked. The one who showed up an hour early to every family event and stayed to help clean up after everyone else had gone home. The one who proofread my cousin's law school application at midnight on a Tuesday because she asked, and I never said no to things like that. I was, in other words, precisely the kind of person whose reputation is both easy to destroy and too proud to beg for restoration. I had no secret child. I had a gym membership I used 3 times a week, a book club I attended on alternating Thursdays, a relationship that had ended 8 months prior, gently, mutually with no drama, and a savings account I was slowly, carefully building toward a down payment on a condo I had been looking at in Edgewood. That was my life. Quiet, deliberate, forward-moving. And Chisholm knew all of it. She knew exactly what I was building and exactly how fragile reputation is when the people holding it for you are willing to let it go the moment someone cries convincingly enough at a dinner table. She didn't choose a financial accusation. She didn't choose a relationship scandal. She chose the one thing that would hit our family and our community at the deepest possible level: motherhood, abandonment, blood, because she understood that in our world, that specific accusation doesn't require evidence. It only requires the right person to say it first. What she didn't calculate, what I'm certain she never thought about for even a single second, was that the same mind she dismissed as too quiet and too careful to fight back was the exact mind that was going to take 9 years of professional documentation instinct and turn it directly toward her. She thought she had neutralized me. She had actually just given me a reason. Here's something I have learned about people who lie the way Chisholm lies. They don't start with the big ones. They start small. They start with something so minor that confronting it makes you look like the unreasonable one. They calibrate. They practice. They learn exactly how much the people around them are willing to overlook in the name of keeping the peace. And then they build on that number, incrementally, until one day they are placing a photograph of a stranger's child on a dinner table, and your mother is pointing at the door, and somehow, you're the villain. I want to tell you about 3 moments. 3 specific moments that I replayed constantly in that empty apartment in the weeks after December 14th, not because I was torturing myself, but because I was finally, for the first time, allowing myself to see the full shape of what had been happening for years. The first moment happened when I was 24 and Chisholm was 21. She called me on a Wednesday afternoon, crying, and even then, I remember noticing the specific quality of those tears, how they arrived too quickly and stopped too cleanly, telling me that she had overdrafted her account and her landlord was threatening to report her to the rental agency. She needed $4,200. She said she would pay it back within 90 days because she was expecting a bonus from her job at the salon where she was doing administrative work. I transferred the money that same evening. I have the transaction record. I have always had the transaction record. The 90 days passed. Then another 90 days. Then a year. When I brought it up, carefully, privately, just the 2 of us on the phone, she told me she had already paid it back in cash during a family visit and that I must have forgotten. She said it with such complete, unbothered certainty that for approximately 45 seconds, I actually questioned my own memory. When I told our mother what had happened, my mother said, "Adiz, your sister is struggling. Why are you keeping score?" That was the end of that conversation. $4,200.
gone.
And I was the one who looked petty for mentioning it. The second moment happened when I was 26. I had been dating a man named Marcus for about 8 months, a project manager, calm, consistent, the kind of person who remembered the small things and showed up when he said he would. Our relationship was good. Not perfect, but genuinely good. We were at the stage where the future was starting to feel like a real conversation rather than a hypothetical one. Chisholm met him at a family barbecue in June. She was warm, funny, charming. The version of herself she performed for audiences she wanted to impress. 3 weeks later, Marcus started pulling back. Shorter texts, canceled plans. The specific energy of someone who has heard something they can't unhear. When he finally told me what happened, he said Chisholm had called him privately. She had gotten his number from my phone during the barbecue while I was helping my mother in the kitchen, and told him that I had a pattern of emotionally withdrawing from relationships when they got serious, that I had cheated on my previous boyfriend, and that she was telling him because she cared about him and didn't want to see him hurt. None of it was true. Not a single word. Marcus and I ended 8 months later. Not entirely because of what she said. Relationships are complicated, and I won't reduce him to a casualty in someone else's story, but the seed she planted never fully left. I could see it sometimes in the way he looked at me when I was quiet. When I confronted Chisholm, she denied making the call. She denied having his number. She looked at me with genuine seeming hurt and said, "I can't believe you would accuse me of something like that. I thought we were sisters." My mother, when I told her, said Chisholm would never do something like that, and asked me why I was always looking for reasons to be upset. The third moment is the one that tells you everything you need to know about how precisely she understood the family system she was operating inside. When I was 28, my father's accounting practice hit a serious rough patch. He lost 2 major clients in the same quarter. One moved out of state, one retired, and the cash flow problem became urgent enough that he considered closing the office. My mother was panicking quietly in the way she does, which means she was cooking enormous amounts of food and not sleeping. I spent 3 weekends building a restructuring proposal for my father's practice. Actual financial modeling, client retention analysis, a revised pricing structure, and a referral incentive program for existing clients. I stayed up until 2 a.m. on a Sunday finishing it, printed it, put it in a folder with dividers and section labels the way I would have presented it at work. My father implemented most of it. Within 6 months, the practice had stabilized. Within a year, it was performing better than it had in 4 years. At a family dinner that Christmas, 8 months before the photograph, my aunt asked my father how he had turned things around. My father smiled and said, "Chisholm helped me think through some ideas." Chisholm, sitting across from me, did not correct him. I looked at her. She picked up her glass of water and took a slow sip and looked at the wall behind my head. I didn't say anything. I had learned by then that saying anything only made me look bitter. What I didn't understand until much later was that these 3 moments, the money, Marcus, the proposal, were not isolated incidents. They were a system. Chisholm was not chaotic. She was not impulsive. She was someone who had spent years studying the exact architecture of our family's trust and learning, with quiet precision, how to redirect it. The photograph wasn't a moment of cruelty. It was the completion of a strategy. And the most dangerous thing about a strategy that has been running for years is that by the time you recognize it for what it has already done most of its damage. But here is what Chisholm never understood about me, and this is the thing that ultimately changed everything. I do not react when I am hurt. I go quiet and I go to work. She mistook my silence for surrender. That was her only real mistake. And it was an enormous one. I want to go back to that table. I want to go back slowly this time because I think the first time I told you about it, I was still moving through it the way I moved through it that night. Quickly, in shock, 1 foot in front of the other just to get to the door without falling apart in front of everyone. But I have had 5 years to sit with the details of that evening, and I want you to understand exactly what happened and exactly how it was constructed, because when you see it clearly, it stops looking like a family tragedy and starts looking like what it actually was. A performance. A very carefully rehearsed one. It was the second Sunday in December. I had driven to my parents' house straight from the gym, still in my workout clothes because my mother had called and said dinner was at 6 and I was running late and she hated when I was late. I remember stopping at a gas station on Covington Highway to buy a bottle of sparkling water because I was still thirsty from the drive. I remember the specific cold of the car door handle when I got back in. I remember these details because the brain does something strange with the minutes before everything changes. It photographs them. It keeps them in extraordinary resolution while everything that comes after becomes a blur. I walked into the house at 6:14 p.m. The smell of pepper soup hit me immediately. My mother was in the kitchen. My father was already at the table with the television on low in the background. Chisholm was sitting across from his usual chair, and when I walked in, she looked up at me and smiled. That smile. I have thought about that smile more times than I can count. It was warm. It was the smile of someone who is genuinely happy to see you, or someone who has practiced that exact expression for this exact moment. I sat down. My mother brought food to the table. We ate for maybe 12 minutes. Normal conversation. My father asked about work. I told him about the senior analyst shortlist. He nodded, said he was proud of me. My mother refilled my water glass without being asked, which is her specific love language. Everything felt completely, entirely normal. And then Chisholm set her fork down. She set it down with a very particular kind of deliberateness, not loudly, not dramatically, just with enough intention that it created a small pause in the room. Then she reached into the handbag that was hanging on the back of her chair, and she took out a photograph, and she placed it face up in the center of the table between the jollof and the plantains. A little girl. Curly hair. Park bench. Somewhere I didn't recognize. My mother looked at the photograph. Then she looked at Chisholm. Then she looked at me. Chisholm's voice, when she started speaking, had that specific quality I described to you before. The tears that arrived too quickly. She said she had been carrying this for 2 years. She said she couldn't carry it anymore. She said that she had met a woman through a mutual contact who had told her about a child, my child, that I had been hiding from the family, that the father was someone I refused to name, that I had left the little girl in an informal care arrangement and sent occasional money to keep the situation quiet, that she, Chisholm, had confronted me privately 6 months ago, and I had threatened to cut off all contact with her if she said anything. Every single word delivered in the voice of a woman who is breaking her own heart to do the right thing. My mother's face changed while Chisholm was speaking. I watched it change in real time, the confusion, the processing, and then the arrival of something I can only describe as a closing, like a door shutting behind her eyes. By the time Chisholm finished talking, my mother had already decided. I said, "That child is not mine. I have never seen that photograph before in my life." My mother said, "Then why does she look like you?" I looked at the photograph again. The little girl had dark skin and curly hair. That was the extent of the resemblance. I said, "She doesn't look like me. Mom, this is not real. There is no child." Chisholm made a sound, not words, just a sound, the specific sound of someone who is too heartbroken to respond to being called a liar, and covered her mouth with her hand. My father still had not spoken. He was looking at his plate with the expression of a man who has decided that whatever happens next is not going to involve him. I said, "Dad." He didn't look up. I felt something shift in my chest then, not panic, not anger, something colder than both of those things. The feeling of understanding, all at once, that there is no version of this conversation where you win, that the performance has already landed, that the verdict was reached before you walked in the door. My mother raised her hand, that flat, stopping gesture, and she said, "Adiz, you will not sit at this table until you tell the truth about what you have done to that child." Then, after a pause that felt like it lasted considerably longer than it did, she pointed at the door. Not with drama, not with tears, just with her index finger, extended toward the hallway, the way you point at something that needs to be moved to another room. I pushed my chair back. I picked up my coat. I looked at Chisholm one final time. She was looking at her hands, which were folded neatly in her lap, which told me everything about her level of actual distress, and I walked to the door. The cold outside was immediate and total. I sat in that parking lot 2 miles away for 2 hours with the heat on full, and my hands in my lap, and my mind doing the thing it does when it is trying to process something it cannot yet fully process. Just circling, returning to the same images without landing anywhere. At 11:47 p.m. my mother's text arrived. Confess the truth and come home. We love you, but we cannot protect a daughter who abandons her own blood. I read it 4 times. I typed 3 different responses and deleted all of them. Then I drove to my empty apartment, unrolled my sleeping bag on the floor of a room with no curtains, opened my work laptop because it was the only familiar thing I had within reach, and I sat there in the dark thinking about one specific detail that had been nagging at me since I left the table. Chisholm had reached into that handbag with no hesitation. No searching. No fumbling. The photograph was right at the top, ready to be retrieved, as though she had practiced the motion of taking it out and placing it down until the gesture looked completely natural. That is not something you do with something you found unexpectedly and brought on impulse. That is something you rehearse. And if she rehearsed it, if she planned it that completely, then there was a trail somewhere. A conversation. A search. A message to someone. A moment where the plan existed in writing before it existed in that dining room. I just had to find it. I opened a new document on my laptop. I typed the date at the top, December 14th. And then I started writing down everything I could remember, in order with timestamps, the way I would begin documenting an audit. I didn't know yet what I was building toward, but I knew how to build it. The first 18 months after December 14th were the kind of quiet that people mistake for healing, but is actually just survival, wearing a calmer face. I went to work. I got the senior analyst promotion, the $22,000 increase, the regional oversight role, the new office with a window that looked out over Buckhead in the mornings when the light was still coming in low and gold. I signed a new lease on a 1-bedroom apartment in Edgewood, the neighborhood I had been saving toward before everything happened. I bought a bed frame, a dining table, 2 chairs, a couch and a shade of green that made me feel, inexplicably, like myself. I built a life that was smaller than the one I had imagined but was entirely, completely mine in a way nothing had ever quite been before. I did not contact my parents. My mother sent 3 messages in the first month, variations of the same theme, confess and come home, and when I didn't respond they stopped. My father sent nothing. Chisholm sent 1 message in January that said only, "I hope you're okay," which I found so remarkable in its audacity that I actually took a screenshot of it immediately, not because I knew why I would need it, but because I had started, by then, to document everything. Instinct. Professional reflex. Whatever you want to call it. I had therapy on Tuesday evenings with a woman named Dr. Paulette Reeves, whose office smelled like cedar, and who had the particular gift of asking the exact question you were trying not to answer. She helped me understand the difference between processing grief and postponing it. She helped me understand that I was doing both simultaneously, which is apparently extremely common, and also extremely exhausting. What she could not help me with, what was not her job to help me with, was the part of my brain that never fully stopped auditing. It was a Tuesday in late February, 14 months after the dinner. Tax season. I was going through my personal financial documents, the meticulous, color-coded system I maintain in a fireproof box under my bed, which my former colleague Danielle once described as genuinely unhinged in the best possible way, when I found a document I hadn't looked at in almost 3 years. It was a bank statement. Joint savings account. A community bank indicator that my grandmother, Mama Chidinma, had opened for Chisholm and me before she passed in 2019. She had added both our names to the account as co-owners with equal access and equal rights, and she had deposited $31,000 into it. Money she had saved over 40 years of working as a seamstress. Money she wanted her granddaughters to have for something real, which was how she phrased it. In her specific way, that meant she trusted us to know what real meant. I had not touched the account since Mama Chidinma died. I think, in the fog of grief, and then in the fog of what happened in December, I had simply forgotten. Or perhaps not forgotten. Perhaps filed it away in the part of my mind reserved for things too painful to look at directly. I logged into the bank's online portal with the credentials I found in my document folder. The account was still open. The balance was $31,000 and some accumulated interest, $31,847 to be precise. Chisholm had not touched it either. I sat with that number for a long moment. Then I picked up my phone and called a financial attorney named Gregory Osei, whose name I had gotten from a colleague the previous year for an unrelated matter and never used. I made an appointment for the following Thursday. But that was not the most important thing I found that February. The most important thing I found that February was in my email. My personal email account, the one I had used through my mid-20s before I switched to a new address around age 27, was one I rarely logged into anymore. It existed mostly as a repository for old receipts and college-era correspondence and the occasional newsletter I had never unsubscribed from. I was logging in that night to retrieve an old utility bill I needed for a document verification, and while I was searching I noticed, in my inbox, an unread message from 3 years prior. November, 3 years before the dinner. The sender was Chisholm's email address. The subject line was blank. I almost scrolled past it. I almost did not open it. The email was not addressed to me. It was a forwarded message, Chisholm forwarding something to what was clearly meant to be a friend's email address, a woman named Beezy, whose address differed from mine by a single transposed letter. A typo. A single character. The kind of mistake that happens when you are typing fast and not paying attention because you are focused on the content of what you are sending rather than where you are sending it. The forwarded message below Chisholm's note was a conversation between Chisholm and someone whose name I didn't recognize, dated 4 months before the December dinner. In it, Chisholm described, in specific, operational detail, her plan. She talked about finding a photograph of a young child that could plausibly pass for a family resemblance. She talked about the timing, waiting until a Sunday dinner when both parents were present, when there was food on the table and a sense of comfort and lowered guard. She talked about the delivery, the tears, the reluctance, the framing of herself as someone breaking a confidence for the greater good. She wrote, and I am going to give you the exact phrasing because I memorized it. Adiz will try to deny it, but she's too proud to beg, and Mummy will never believe her over me anyway. It just needs to land once. That's all it needs to do. I read that sentence 6 times. Then I did what I do when I encounter information that has the potential to be consequential. I closed my emotional response down like a window on a screen, not forever, not permanently, just temporarily, and I went into documentation mode. I forwarded the email to myself at my current address. I took 4 separate screenshots. I printed a hard copy on my home printer. I saved a PDF to 2 different cloud storage folders and 1 external hard drive that lives in the same fireproof box as my financial documents. Then I did one more thing. The photograph, the little girl on the park bench, had been sitting in my memory for 14 months, and I had occasionally, in idle moments, tried to think about where it might have come from. That night, I ran a reverse image search. It took 11 minutes. The photograph was real. The child was real. Her name was not mine to share, but her mother, a woman I will call Renata, had posted the image publicly on a community parenting forum 3.5 years before it appeared on my parents' dining table. Renata had no idea her daughter's photograph had been used this way. I found her contact information through the forum. I drafted a message that took me 4 attempts to get right, careful, factual, not emotional, explaining exactly what had happened and how I had come to find her. I pressed send, and then I sat very still in my green couch in my Edgewood apartment, and I listened to the sound of my own breathing for a long time. My phone rang 40 minutes later. The area code was one I didn't recognize. It was Renata, and she was not calm. I want to be very clear about something before I tell you what happened next. I did not want to destroy my sister. I know how that sounds, given everything I have just told you. I know it might read as the kind of thing people say when they want to appear measured and reasonable before describing something that is neither of those things. But I mean it with complete sincerity, and I think the way I proceeded in the months that followed is the evidence for it. Because what I built was not a weapon. It was a record. And there is a significant difference between those two things, a difference I understood at a cellular level from 9 years of compliance work. A weapon is designed to hurt someone. A record is designed to tell the truth. I was interested in the truth. What happened to people as a consequence of it being told was, at that point, entirely up to them. Underscore 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 underscore. The morning after I found the email and spoke to Renata, I called Gregory Osei and moved our Thursday appointment to the following Monday. I told him I had two matters, one involving a joint savings account and one involving potential defamation with documented evidence. He told me to bring everything. I brought everything. I brought the printed email. I brought the screenshots. I brought the PDF on a USB drive. I brought the bank statements for the joint account going back to the date of my grandmother's death. I brought the transaction record from 2019 showing the $4,200 I had transferred to Chisholm that was never repaid. I brought the text message my mother had sent me on the night of December 14th. I brought the screenshot of Chisholm's January message asking if I was okay. Gregory looked at the email for a long time without speaking. Then he looked up and said, "Where did you find this?" I told him. He said, "And you haven't shown this to your family yet?" I said no. He nodded slowly, in the way that lawyers nod when they are thinking faster than they are speaking, and then he said, "Good.
Don't.
Not yet. Underscore 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 underscore. The first thing we addressed was the joint savings account. Gregory confirmed what I had suspected. As a co-owner with equal rights, I had full legal access to the funds. I was not required to notify Chisholm before making a withdrawal. I was not required to split the funds in any particular way unless a prior legal agreement existed, which it did not. Mama Chidinma had left no written instructions beyond the account structure itself. I withdrew my half, $15,923 transferred to my personal savings account on a Wednesday morning in March. Clean, legal, documented. I kept the transaction records. The remaining balance, Chisholm's share, I left entirely untouched. I was not interested in taking what wasn't mine. I was interested in taking exactly what was. Underscore 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 underscore. The second matter was more delicate and took considerably longer. Gregory connected me with a colleague of his, a civil attorney named Sandra Kwan, who specialized in defamation and reputational harm cases. Sandra was small, precise, and had the specific energy of someone who finds procedural detail genuinely exciting, which made me trust her immediately. Sandra reviewed the email. She reviewed the documented pattern. The dinner, my mother's text, the community context, the professional and personal consequences of being publicly labeled within our network as a woman who had abandoned her child. She told me that what Chisholm had done met the threshold for defamation with documented intent, and that the email, a written record of premeditation, was, in her words, the kind of thing that makes cases significantly less complicated. We did not file immediately. Sandra advised patience, not indefinite patience, but strategic patience. She wanted to send one communication first. A letter, certified mail, return receipt requested, addressed jointly to my parents at the Decatur house. The letter was 4 pages long. It was not angry. It did not use the word revenge or punishment or even apology. It was written in the specific register of legal correspondence, measured, formal, precise, and it contained 3 things: a factual account of the events of December 14th, a full copy of the email Chisholm had accidentally sent to my address, and a documented timeline showing the premeditated nature of what had occurred. It also contained, on the final page, a single paragraph noting that while no legal action had been initiated at this time, all documentation had been preserved and all options remained open. Sanders sent it on a Thursday in April. Certified. Return receipt. The green card came back signed 8 days later. My mother's signature. I put it in the fireproof box. Meanwhile, Renata had not been idle. When I spoke to her that first night, She had been furious in the way that a mother whose child's image has been taken and used without consent has every right to be furious. I had been careful in that conversation. I gave her the facts, I gave her the documentation I had, and I told her clearly that whatever she chose to do with the information was entirely her decision. I was not asking her to act on my behalf. I was telling her because she had a right to know. Renata contacted an attorney of her own within a week of our conversation. She filed a formal complaint with the platform where the photograph had originally been posted, which triggered their own internal investigation. She also sent a formal cease and desist to Chisholm directly, naming her by full name, citing the specific use of her daughter's image, and demanding written acknowledgement and a signed commitment that the image would not be used or distributed further. I was not involved in that process. I did not need to be. I had simply told the truth to the person most directly harmed, and she had done what any mother would do. Chisholm received Renata's cease and desist on a Tuesday. She received my parents' copy of Sandra's letter, forwarded to her by my mother, I later learned, on a Thursday of the same week. 2 days apart. 2 separate fronts. Neither of them orchestrated to arrive simultaneously. That was simply the timing of how truth moves when it has been properly documented and released. I found out later, through a cousin who called me in late May with the specific nervous energy of someone delivering information they aren't sure they should be delivering, that Chisholm had called my mother the night she received the forwarded letter and had been on the phone for 3 hours. I do not know what was said in that conversation. What I know is that my mother called me the following morning for the first time in 16 months. I let it go to voicemail. Her message was 47 seconds long. She said my name twice. She said she needed to talk to me. She said she was sorry, and the word sorry came out of her in a way that sounded like it had cost her something considerable to produce. I did not call back immediately. I waited 4 days because I needed those 4 days to decide what version of myself was going to have that conversation, the one who was still raw, or the one who had done the work. I chose the second one. We spoke for 1 hour and 40 minutes. It was not a resolution. It was a beginning, fragile, careful, imperfect in the way that all real beginnings are. My father called 2 days after that. His call was shorter, 11 minutes, and mostly silence with words placed carefully inside it, which is the most emotional I have ever heard Emmanuel Okonkwo be in my entire life. With Chisholm there was nothing. No call. No message. Not for another 3.5 years. I did not chase it. I had learned, by then, that the most powerful thing I could do was simply continue building my life with the same deliberate care I had always applied to it, and let time do what time does to people who have built their comfort on other people's silence. I never filed the defamation case. Not because I couldn't, because I didn't need to. The email existed. My parents had seen it. Renata had filed her complaint. The record was complete. Sometimes the most powerful thing the truth can do is simply be known by the people who matter, and then sit quietly in a fireproof box under your bed, available, waiting, in case it is ever needed again. It never was. 3 years and 4 months after the letter. A Friday night in early April, cold the way April sometimes still is in Atlanta, when the season hasn't fully committed to itself yet. I was asleep. My phone rang at 1:07 a.m. I know the exact time because I looked at it with the specific disorientation of someone pulled out of deep sleep, and the number on the screen was one I had not deleted but had not looked at in years. No contact name. Just the number. But I knew it the way you know certain things in your body before your mind catches up. I answered. Chisholm's voice on the other end was not the voice I remembered. It was smaller. Frightened in a way that sounded structural rather than performed, the kind of frightened that lives below the place where performance can reach. She said my name. Then she said she was at Grady Memorial. Then she said internal bleeding and they're saying surgery and I don't. And then she stopped, and in the silence I could hear the specific ambient sound of an emergency room at 1 a.m., distant intercom, someone crying 2 curtains over, the low constant hum of a building that never fully sleeps. I asked her where in the hospital she was. She told me. I asked her if she had called anyone else. She said, I called Marcus first. The number was disconnected. I called Mummy, but she's in Nigeria visiting Auntie Uju, and I didn't want her to panic from that far away. I called Beezy, but she didn't pick up. A pause. Then, "You were the next name." I held the phone against my ear in the dark of my bedroom for a moment. Not deliberating. Not performing deliberation for some imaginary audience. Just being, briefly, a human being in the middle of the night who has just received a call from the person who altered the trajectory of her life with a single lie told over pepper soup and plantains. I said, "I'm coming. Don't hang up." I drove through Atlanta at 1 a.m. with the city looking the way it only looks at that hour, emptied of itself, all the surfaces lit, but none of the usual human noise filling the space between them. I parked in the Grady Visitor Structure on Jesse Hill Jr. Drive, and I walked through the entrance and past the triage desk and down the corridor to the bay number she had given me, and the nurses looked at me the way ER nurses look at people arriving in the middle of the night. Assessment, neutral, efficient. Chisholm was in a curtained bay, for in her left arm, a monitor tracking something steady and green above her head. She looked smaller than I remembered her. Her hair was pulled back. She was not wearing any of the things she usually wore. No particular expression, no performance, no carefully arranged version of herself. She was just a person in a hospital gown at 1 a.m. who was frightened. She looked at me when I walked in, and something in her face did something I don't have a clean word for. Not relief, exactly. More like recognition. The specific recognition of someone who has been alone with something terrible and has just been joined by another person, regardless of who that person is or what the history is between them. I sat down in the chair beside her bed. She didn't say anything for a while. Neither did I. The monitor beeped its steady green rhythm. Someone in the next bay was being asked questions in a loud, slow voice. Then Chisholm turned her head toward me and she said, in a voice so quiet I had to lean forward slightly to hear it, "I'm sorry, Adiz." 2 words. 3, technically. The simplest grammatical construction in the English language for the thing it is trying to do. I looked at her. I looked at the 4 in her arm, and the monitor above her head, and the hospital bracelet on her wrist, with her full name printed on it in small black font. Chisholm Adora Okonkwo. The name we share the second half of, in the way that Nigerian families layer names like that. Adiz, Adora, the same root, the same meaning. Nobility. That had always struck me as something, even in the worst of it. I felt, and I want to be honest with you about this, because I think honesty is the only reason this story is worth telling. I felt nothing that resembled the satisfaction I might have imagined feeling in this moment during the years when I was still raw enough to imagine it. I did not feel vindicated. I did not feel the clean, cinematic relief of a debt being paid. What I felt was the weight of 5 years. Not as anger, just as weight. The specific heaviness of time that has passed and cannot be returned, that sits in your chest not as a wound anymore, but as a fact. An irreversible, permanent, specific fact. I said, "I know." And then I stayed. I stayed through the surgical consult at 3 a.m. I stayed through the paperwork, through the waiting room, through the surgeon coming out at 6:15 a.m. to say the procedure had gone well, and she would need 2 to 3 days of monitoring, but the prognosis was good. I called my mother in Nigeria, it was early afternoon there, and told her calmly that Chisholm had been in hospital, that she was out of surgery, that she was going to be fine, and that I would keep her updated. My mother made a sound on the phone that I had not heard from her in 5 years, a sound of genuine, unguarded relief. And then she said my name in a way that carried more inside it than names usually carry. I drove home as the sun was coming up over the city. I showered. I made coffee. I sat at my dining table, my table in my apartment, in the life I had built from a sleeping bag on an empty floor, and I drank it while the light came through the window the way it does in Edgewood in the early morning, low and gold, and entirely indifferent to everything that has ever happened to anyone. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from today. And if this story stayed with you, if some part of it felt familiar in a way you weren't expecting, share it with someone who needs to hear it. I'll see you in the next one.